Equifax fires an employee who discovers how bad their system is. Hi, this is Consumer Protection Attorney Bill Clanton. I help people deal with bad background checks, credit reporting errors, and all kinds of consumer-related matters. I just came across this case this morning. This is crazy stuff. Equifax fired an employee when they discovered how bad their system is, and that employee followed his obligation, tried to report it to the CFPB. They were terminated. We're going to go over the lawsuit. This lawsuit was just filed in mid-June this year. There's not been any answers on it, but this is one we're going to follow. I'll be giving you updates on this case. This is a Leary v. Equifax. All right, let's dig in here. This is just the lawsuit. This is the plaintiff's allegations in the case. Nothing's been proven. I don't have any evidence in this case yet, but this is the lawsuit. Okay, this case is about a company punishing a dedicated employee for refusing to play ball when it tried to cover up regulatory violations that placed the financial security of everyday Americans in jeopardy. Mr. Stephen Leary, that's our plaintiff here, Mr. Leary, is an experienced compliance professional and a licensed attorney actively barred in the state of Florida. So he can practice law in the state of Florida. He worked at Equifax as an auditor from 2018 to 2020, performing compliance assessments on an enterprise-wide basis for Equifax, as assigned to him by the Director of Regulatory Compliance Testing, Mr. Chris Smotherman. Okay. The compliance testing program was mandated by the CFPB and required Leary and his colleagues to test Equifax compliance procedures against governing federal law and regulations. Let's go through here and highlight our people. Okay, Leary and Smotherton. Mr. Leary's testing uncovered Equifax committed numerous serious violations of the Consumer Financial Protection Act, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and other laws, rules, orders, standards, and prohibitions under the CFPB's jurisdiction. Congress passed these laws and created the CFPB to protect everyday American families, people like me and you, who are categorically dependent on the accuracy and fairness of credit reports so they can purchase homes, rent apartments, purchase cars, obtain small business loans and credit cards. The violations covered by Leary and Smotherman and the compliance testing team were so numerous and systematic, it's clear that Equifax had enterprise-wide compliance failures. Not just problems, failures. Mr. Leary reported Equifax's compliance violations to Equifax's upper management, including Shannon Anderson, VP and Quality Manager of Customer Operations, and Adele Braxton Fields, Senior Vice President and Deputy Chief Compliance Officer. In response, instead of commending Mr. Leary's work for identifying significant compliance exposure, Ms. Fields and Ms. Anderson tried to bury the results and told him that Equifax should report false information to the CFPB. Instead, Smotherman and Leary published their findings as their job duties and the CFPB requires. Over the next several months, Smotherman and another member of the compliance testing team were terminated. And after Mr. Leary resisted Equifax's efforts to bury his findings instead of providing truthful information, was placed on bogus performance improvement plan that asked him to, among other things, demonstrate he did not have an us versus them mentality with respect to the company. In June 2020, Mr. Leary learned that Equifax had provided additional false information. Equifax had provided false information to the CFPB in an effort to cover up its regulatory violations. Mr. Leary contacted the CFPB to correct the record and make them aware Equifax had a pattern of covering up violations and punishing employees like him who opposed it. Mr. Leary also complained to Human Resources and Equifax's Office of the General Counsel that he was being retaliated against, but still completed every task asked of him in his PIP and his Performance Improvement Plan. Regardless, on July 6, 2020, the final day of his Performance Improvement Plan, Equifax completed its retaliation against Mr. Leary and terminated him. Okay, as of the date of this filing, nearly every member of Equifax's compliance department during Mr. Leary's tenure is no longer with the company. Okay, and this goes into what they why he's suing them under the laws he's suing them. Now, this is not a normal fair credit case or something like that. This is an employment law case. It's not the focus of our firm here, but this is very interesting information about Equifax. Now, to bring a employment law claim, you have to go to the Department of Labor and exhaust the administrative remedies. That was done here. The parties, Mr. Leary, at the time of this action, was a resident of the state of Georgia. He now resides in Utah. Equifax, Consumer Reporting Agency. Okay, statement of facts. Now, this is where we're getting some more details about what happened to Leary. Okay, Equifax is one of the 3 largest consumer reporting agencies in the United States. Of course, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion are the big 3 credit reporting agencies. Equifax is regulated in part by the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the Consumer Financial Protection Act, Dodd-Frank, Title X of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. Statutes are administered under the jurisdiction of the CFPB. With the passage of the Consumer Financial Protection Act and the creation of the CFPB, Congress created a federal system of consumer financial services regulation for credit reporting agencies, banks, and non-bank lenders. For the first time in American history, non-banks like Equifax are now subject to intensive bank-like federal regulation of their consumer financial operations. And in 2016, OSHA provided the final text of regulations governing employee protection whistleblower provisions of the CFPA. Okay. Mr. Leary's employment. Mr. Stephen Leary is an experienced compliance professional and licensed attorney actively barred in the state of Florida. He began working at Equifax as a compliance specialist on or about May 2018, promoted to a senior compliance auditor in 2019. So Mr. Leary is not messing around. He is a serious compliance professional. All right. At all relevant times, Leary worked in the Equifax Compliance Office, ECO, on the compliance testing team. The compliance testing team was purportedly created in response to a directive of the CFPB to ensure Equifax fulfilled its regulatory obligations. So Equifax said, oh, yeah, we're creating this office, the compliance testing team, to make sure we're meeting the CFPB standards. Mr. Leary excelled at his role. Based on performance evaluation finding he exceeds expectations, Mr. Leary is promoted to the senior auditor position in 2019. Okay. Mr. Leary's primary job duty involved performing compliance assessments on an enterprise-wide basis for Equifax, as assigned to him by the Director of Regulatory Compliance Testing, Mr. Smothermun. Okay. Mr. Leary was given assignments by Equifax, some of which were mandated by the CFPB, that required he and his colleagues to test Equifax's, including its vendors and subcontractors, compliance procedures and policies against the governing federal law and regulations, including the CFPA and the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Once a compliance assessment was completed and the underlying data was verified, the assessment report is published internally and emailed to the executive management, including the Chief Compliance Officer and General Counsel. Mr. Leary conducts the CCP testing and finds numerous violations under the CFPB's jurisdiction. Look at this. Wow. He starts turning up some dirt. Okay. Mr. Leary's assignments in 2019 included an internal testing and review of the Consumer Complaints Program. The CFPB considers consumer complaints to be a vital indicator of the accuracy, fairness, and security of the credit reporting products sold by companies like Equifax, and the CFPB mandates that Equifax must administer the CCP pursuant to its supervisory authority over non-depository covered entities like Equifax. That's a mouthful. The supervisory authority over credit reporting agencies. Specific requirements mandated for CPP are set forth in Dodd-Frank, particularly in 12 U.S.C. 5534 and the CFPB's Compliance Management System. This is the Compliance Management System document on the Fair Credit Reporting Act I was able to pull up. It's some 86 pages, quite lengthy. All right, and quite dense too. I'll go over that in another video. An entity's adherence to the CCP requirements is examined pursuant to and tested against the rules, orders, standards, and prohibitions adopted by the Bureau, including those set forth in the CFPB's examination manual. This is the examination manual. Okay. Mr. Leary and his other team members designed and built relevant tests in compliance with these rules, orders, standards, and prohibitions, and tested the CCP processes and procedures. On and around July 2019, Mr. Smotherman assigned the primary testing responsibility of the CCP review to Mr. Leary. The project was met with resistance from senior management in Equifax's global and consumer business services from its inception because GCS was aware that for years the CCP was found to be deficient in numerous areas. GCS, Global Consumer Business Services, did not want the Equifax board or the CFPB to become aware it had neglected to remediate these deficiencies and avoid the costs associated with remediation. I've talked about this in other videos. Credit reporting agencies like Equifax don't make any money being more compliant. They don't make any money from their dispute handling processes. They don't make any money from compliance. So they are not interested in doing it. They're interested in selling credit monitoring services, selling you credit reports, but they're not interested in properly handling disputes. Okay, and this backs that up. Right, to keep those failures undisclosed, management in GCS sought to delay or even halt CCP testing. To this end, Shannon Anderson, we've met before, and quality manager on behalf of Tony Weeks, senior vice president and senior group manager GCS, lobbied Kent Lindler, chief risk and compliance officer, to cancel the testing before it could be completed. So here you've got somebody who's Smotherman and Leary, who are testing the Equifax system, and you've got the senior management trying to stop them. Shannon Anderson, vice president, and Tony Weeks, senior vice president and senior group manager of GCS, of the Global Consumer Business Services, lobbies Kent Lindler, the chief risk and compliance officer, to cancel the testing before it can be completed because they know their system's bad. When Smotherman sent an email stating the testing was set to begin and explaining the process, Mr. Weeks, Senior Vice President Weeks, replied directly to Smotherman in an unprecedented move, intervened in the testing process by questioning the decision to begin the CFPB's mandated testing. Ms. Anderson joined in and reiterated her displeasure about the testing. These senior people are stepping on the people below them, trying to get them to stop lifting up the rug. Over the course of Mr. Leary's work, he and other members of the compliance testing team were met with substantial resistance from Equifax's upper management to conduct their compliance assessments due to concern that Equifax's numerous violations would be uncovered in the process. Violations that are reportable, reported to, or reviewable by the CFPB. At the direction of Smotherman, Mr. Leary pressed on with his work and conducted the testing, despite upper management attempting to prevent Mr. Leary from accessing the data he needed to do the testing. The results confirmed upper management's fears. By September 2019, Mr. Leary's testing uncovered that Equifax committed numerous violations of the CFPA, the rules, orders, standards, prohibitions governing consumer complaints adopted by the CFPB. Prior to reporting the results to Equifax's upper management, Mr. Leary summarized the findings, sent them to Juan Torres, the applicable subject matter expert in GCS, to confirm the underlying facts. Mr. Torres confirmed in an email to Mr. Leary that the data was correct. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, based on these findings, Mr. Leary formed a reasonable belief that Equifax committed numerous violations of the CFPA, and other laws, rules, orders, standards, prohibitions under the CFPB's jurisdiction. For example, here it is, guys. All right, Equifax was not timely or adequately responding to CFPB portal complaints in violation of 12 U.S.C. 5534B. Not identifying, tracking, trending all complaints received from consumers pursuant to the CFPB standards for effective consumer complaint management, and the ECO is reporting incorrect complaint data to Equifax's Board Compliance Committee and the CFPB. Yeah, their own internal compliance team was reporting incorrect complaint data to the Board Compliance Committee and to the CFPB. They were just putting this under the rug. Mr. Leary's reports to the CCP and the ECO upper management. Throughout September to December 2018, Mr. Leary reported Equifax's CPP compliance violations to Equifax's upper management in GCS and the ECO, including Ms. Anderson and Braxton Fields, who we met earlier, Senior Vice President and Deputy Chief Compliance Officer. The information Mr. Leary reported included broadly, oh boy, guys, Equifax is not adequately responding to CFPB portal complaints as required by Dodd-Frank. Equifax is not responding to CFPB portal complaints within the timeline set forth in Dodd-Frank's implementing regulations. Equifax's operations, specifically the vendors it outsources, was not capturing and reporting the vast majority of complaints received. The vast majority of complaints received. Okay. The complaint numbers reported did not align with underlying reporting data Mr. Leary is able to examine, and the ECO directed analysis to report certain non-compliant items as complaints, non-complaint items as complaints. Numerous gaps exist within the quality program that allowed these violations to occur. Numerous gaps. In response, instead of commending Mr. Leary's work, right, so instead of saying, hey, thanks for finding these problems in our system, we're going to work hard to make it right so we can follow the law, Ms. Fields and Ms. Anderson tried to bury the results. For example, they resisted Mr. Leary and Ms. Smotherman's publishing of the CCP compliance report that detailed many of Equifax's violations, even though failing to publish the report would cause Equifax to willingly commit another serious violation of the CFPA and CFPB regulations. So they wanted to hide this data from the CFPB, even though that hiding would be another violation. This is very sensitive data for them. Okay, Ms. Fields even went so far as to tell them that one violation, that Equifax failed to report the accurate number of consumer complaints, should not be published at all. That Equifax should just continue to report false numbers to appease the CFPB. The Consumer Financial Protection Act provides that it shall be unlawful for any covered person to fail or refuse, as required by federal consumer financial law, or any rule or other order issued by the Bureau thereunder, to provide information to the Bureau. They wanted to violate that rule. When Mr. Leary and Ms. Smotherman submitted the final draft report detailing the CCP findings to Ms. Anderson, she was furious and immediately requested a next day meeting with Mr. Lindler and Mr. Smotherman to object to the findings, after previously verifying their accuracy while providing no factual basis for objections. This was not the first time that Mr. Leary and Ms. Smotherman had been asked to alter or withhold compliance testing findings. For example, by this point, Mr. Leary and Ms. Smotherman had been asked to delete testing findings that cast Equifax as a violator of laws, rules, orders, standards, and or prohibitions under the CFPB jurisdiction on multiple occasions. In January 2020, Smotherman and Leary published the CCP findings as required by Equifax's own board-approved compliance policy and the CFPB guidelines for compliance management by circulating the final report to Equifax's executive management. Okay. Equifax decapitates the compliance testing team and fills it with GCS supplicants. Okay, now Equifax has to get back. They have to retaliate against Smotherman and Leary here. Let's see what happens. Okay, Equifax's retribution for publishing the findings was swift. Ms. Fields and Ms. Anderson became upset with Mr. Leary and Mr. Smotherman. And within approximately 1 month of publication, February 2020, Ms. Smotherman and Fred Paduano, another member of the compliance testing team who pushed back against Equifax's efforts to hide violations, were abruptly terminated, reportedly due to their positions being eliminated. Not transparent. Okay, following Smotherman's termination, Mr. Leary was assigned a new supervisor, Molly Whitehouse. It's a new person here in our story. Ms. Whitehouse had little to no relevant compliance experience and reported directly to Ms. Fields. Ms. Whitehouse's lack of compliance experience was evident when she asked on a group call if she was going to have to read regulations. Oh boy. I mean, this stuff is dense, guys. Here's the Fair Credit Reporting Act regulations. This is 86 pages of small print. I mean, and this is one of several of these manuals. Okay. Miss Whitehouse had very little interaction with Mr. Leary as she worked out of her home in New Jersey, never met Mr. Leary or the members of the testing team during his tenure. I only worked half days, a compliance officer working half days. Miss Whitehouse was a close associate of Miss Anderson and Miss Weeks and reported directly to Miss Fields. Okay. Mr. Leary's FCRA testing reveals hundreds of thousands of FCRA violations. We're getting juicy now. Okay. Prior to the terminations of Mr. Smotherman and Mr. Paduano, Mr. Leary was also performing additional assigned compliance assessments of certain FCRA requirements. In January 2020, Mr. Leary's scoping of this testing revealed Equifax had missed hundreds of thousands of dispute processing deadlines imposed by the FCRA. If you got a late response or a non-response from Equifax, Leary uncovered it. And let's see what they did. In the second half of 2019 alone, and it was not clear that all of these failures had been adequately self-reported as claimed or that the underlying cause of these failures had been addressed. So this is still happening. Based on this initial discovery, Mr. Leary formed a reasonable belief that Equifax had committed thousands of violations of the FCRA and or other laws, rules, standards, and prohibitions under the CFPB's jurisdiction. In January 2020, Leary presented his information about the FCRA violations to Sarah Cunningham. That is a new person in our story, and a new employee that Miss Anderson had hired at the beginning of 2020 to whom all new testing requests must go. When presenting this information, Mr. Leary made a formal information request to Miss Cunningham for specific data he required to complete the testing. In response, Miss Cunningham became angry and told him she would not give him the information required to do the testing and he needed to rethink the way he conducted testing. He was uncovering too much bad stuff. After Smotherman's termination, Miss Whitehouse, at the direction of Miss Fields, told Mr. Leary to pause this FCRA testing altogether, and Mr. Leary was never allowed to continue his investigation or report his findings. Leary objects to ECO's upper management instructions to submit false data to the CFPB. In April 2020, Miss Whitehouse and Miss Cunningham instructed Mr. Leary to reword and repackage all the testing findings discovered by Leary, Smotherman, and Paduano. Instead of addressing the reported violations, Miss Whitehouse specifically instructed Mr. Leary to ignore his findings, make the existing data work, and to falsely state on reports accessible to the CFPB that Equifax had remedied any identified issues, that when Miss Whitehouse knew this to be false, and based on Mr. Leary's verified findings, it continued feedback to Miss Whitehouse, and the findings had not been adequately remediated. In response, Leary objects to Whitehouse's instructions to ignore and otherwise close unremediated findings. And on May 5th, 2020, he forwarded Miss Whitehouse the email of Mr. Torres confirming the accuracy of his CCP findings about numerous unremedied CCP violations. Okay, we're getting near the end here. On May 14th, 2020, Equifax retaliated against Leary by effectively stripping him of his job duties and placing him on an unsubstantiated performance improvement plan, which included nebulous requirements such as demanding he improve his tone, provide evidence that he does not have an us versus them mentality. Mr. Leary's PIP was particularly bogus because Mr. Leary had received a glowing performance review by Mr. Smotherman just weeks prior to receiving the PIP. Mr. Smotherman had personally supervised Mr. Leary for nearly 2 years at the time he made his review. In contrast, Miss Whitehouse had only been Mr. Leary's supervisor for approximately 2 months when she gave him a PIP. And Miss Whitehouse, who worked in New Jersey, had never personally met Mr. Leary and had little to no contact with him during the half days she worked. Mr. Leary completed every task assigned to him despite the obvious retaliatory nature of the PIP. Mr. Leary provides information to the CFPB and complains to Equifax of retaliation. In mid-2019, Mr. Leary was also tasked designing and conducting compliance assessments. Overall purpose of the FCRA's regulation of Equifax through the CFPB with respect to data furnishers was to ensure that Equifax had reasonable procedures in place for ensuring the maximum possible accuracy of consumer credit reports. That's what the FCRA is all about, and that's what the CFPB is trying to do with Equifax. Mr. Leary was assigned to review the Data Furniture Monitoring Program, the DFMP, by Mr. Smotherman because Mr. Smotherman's risk assessment had indicated the DFMP was potentially deficient, and the CFPB was scheduled to perform their own official supervisory examination of the program later that year. Pursuant to his obligations as the Director of Compliance Testing, Mr. Smotherman wanted to ensure any deficiencies were identified and remediation plans were put in place to ensure Equifax was complying with the FCRA and the CFPB rules. Mr. Leary conducted the review and discovered the program was in fact deficient as Mr. Smotherman had originally assessed, and significant risk existed, and Equifax was violating 1681 EB as well as supervisory orders. Mr. Leary and Ms. Smotherman published the final furniture monitoring report to Equifax's senior management after significant delay and interference from Fields, reporting that Equifax had potentially violated the Fair Credit Reporting Act and the CFPB's guidance regarding data furniture and monitoring, and numerous violations of Equifax's previous agreements with the CFPB on the subject. July 3rd, 2019, Leary submitted his assessment's preliminary findings to Fields, who modified the findings at her discretion. And on September 20th, after publishing his final modified version of the report to Equifax's senior management, as previously stated, Mr. Smotherman resubmitted the final report to Ms. Fields because Smotherman had become aware that CFPB was directly requesting it, and Ms. Fields had been tasked with overseeing, providing documents, otherwise adequately responding to the CFPB's requests. However, despite Leary's and Smotherman's circulation of their final report on the DFMP review to senior management, Ms. Fields, on around May 2020, provided Equifax their official supervisory letter regarding the DFMP and furniture monitoring compliance. In the letter, the CFPB was under the erroneous impression that no DFMP compliance audit compliance assessment had been scheduled or conducted during a review period that included 2019, even though Leary and Smotherman had done it. And the Bureau independently confirmed the substance of Mr. Leary's DFMP findings, stating directly Equifax had in fact violated the Fair Credit Reporting Act and that the data furniture monitoring program was seriously deficient. Okay. CFPB's finding that Equifax did not do a data furniture monitoring compliance assessment during this review period was based on false information provided by Equifax in direct violation of Dodd-Frank, as Mr. Leary personally conducted such a compliance assessment in 2019 at the direction of Smotherman, as previously described. In response, in June 2020, Mr. Leary had several direct communications with the CFPB. Through these communications, Mr. Leary discussed how he believed Equifax and or Ms. Fields had falsely told the CFPB that Equifax did not conduct the testing, did not have any data on the testing, in direct violation of the law. Mr. Leary explained in his report, demonstrated that Equifax and or Ms. Fields had lied to the CFPB about the testing Equifax conducted, including negative results of testing, failed or refused to provide information contained in the assessment report to the CFPB, and attempted to cover up Equifax's regulatory violations. Mr. Leary informed the CFPB at this time that Equifax, the ECO, and Ms. Fields had a pattern of modifying testing reports to make the findings appear to be less significant than discovered by the testing team. That Equifax serially retaliated against employees who pushed back against this practice, including himself, Smotherman, and Paduano. In his communications with the CFPB, Mr. Leary provided the CFPB with a report on Equifax's ID theft program, which Leary had participated in, had been completed by his colleague Paduano, which demonstrated that Equifax and Fields had failed or refused to provide information contained in the report to the Bureau as required by the CFPB. Instead, had attempted to cover up violations regarding blocking information when the FTC ID theft reports were received. So, if you submitted an ID theft report to Equifax and it wasn't honored, this is why. On information and belief, CFPB communicated to Equifax and or Ms. Fields that it had learned of the failure or refusal to provide the information contained in the furniture monitoring and identity theft reports to the Bureau as required by the CFPB. On information and belief, on learning that the CFPB had obtained the furniture monitoring an ID theft report from someone else at Equifax, Ms. Fields knew that Mr. Leary was an individual who provided the CFPB with one or both reports. On June 3rd, Leary and his attorney complained in a detailed letter to Equifax's Associate General Counsel, Suzanne Alford, that he was being retaliated against in violation of the law, based on his protected activity reporting violations under CFPB jurisdiction and opposing activities that would constitute additional violations under the CFPB jurisdiction. In June 2020, Mr. Leary's attorney spoke to Ms. Alford and told her that Mr. Leary was speaking to the CFPB about the compliance testing team's findings. On June 15th, Mr. Leary sent an email to HR Senior Director Krista Sinagra, complaining that he was being retaliated against. His previous complaints to HR about the retaliation were being ignored. He retained counsel with respect to Equifax's ongoing retaliation. Ms. Sinagra did not respond to Mr. Leary and was later promoted to Vice President of Human Resources. Wow. On July 6, 2020, the final day of his PIP, Equifax completed its retaliation against Mr. Leary and terminated him. Now, this video has been going on for a while. And here's an unlawful discharge retaliation. This is the law that protects people, whistleblowers like Mr. Leary. But guys, Mr. Leary is a hero. I mean, there's no other way of saying this. Equifax has a pattern and practice of breaking the law. They deal with the most sensitive information for millions, hundreds of millions of Americans, and they don't handle it properly. And Mr. Leary figured it out, told Equifax, and got resistance from his middle management and upper management. They told him to lie. When he refused, he was terminated. All right, guys, this shows you about Equifax. If your complaints, if your disputes to Equifax are being ignored, you know why. Equifax is a bad actor, and they've got a ton of responsibility on the shoulders to ensure the maximum possible accuracy of your credit report, and they're clearly not doing it. We're going to keep an eye on this case. I have an alert set, so I'll get an email every time there's something filed in it, and I'll keep you guys updated on it. Alrighty, thanks for watching, guys. If you have a credit reporting issue, feel free to give us a call. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.